When writing some of these reviews, I have to go deep. I mean real deep. And I don't just mean when I'm reviewing the same game for a second time on a different platform. Like, say, for instance, reviewing Lethal Enforcers for the Genesis, and then coming back for a second helping and reviewing an almost identical release in Lethal Enforcers for the Sega CD. I'm really not looking forward to having to do that for a second time with Lethal Enforcers 2. But anyway, like I said, that's not really what I mean in this instance. What I'm referring to here is a game that, on the surface, there probably isn't a whole lot to write about it. And it's a game that is pretty obscure by 2025 standards, largely because there isn't a lot to write about it. This is where the almost 40-year-old pop culture references come in. Let me ask a question. What is Jean-Claude Van Damme's best movie? Kickboxer? Double Impact? Hard Target? Maybe Universal Soldier? Oh, wait, I know. Street Fighter. Duh. Kidding. Of course, Van Damme's best movie is the 1988 tour de force Bloodsport, with Van Damme starring as the quasi-fictional Frank Dukes, opposite famous martial arts heavy Bolo Yeung, as one of the most memorable bad guys in martial arts history in Chong Li. But Frank didn't take on Chong Li by himself. No, Jean-Claude had a little help from Donald Gibb, playing the very American Ray Jackson. And by a little help, I mean a real little help, as Ray almost got himself killed underestimating Chong Li, setting up a nice little revenge plot for Frank. However, I should probably, pause for a second, because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because you clicked on a review for an obscure Genesis game and now you're getting a dissertation on how Bloodsport is the greatest Hollywood martial arts movie of all time. Well, hi, my name is Dave, and don't worry, just like Agent Rollins, I'm gonna bring it home. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally, the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Okay, seriously, you're probably wondering why I started out the intro talking about Bloodsport. Well, it's because of Frank Dukes and Ray Jackson. Frank Dukes is, of course, a buttoned-up and well-trained army captain who clearly has spent his share of time in the dojo. And Ray Jackson is practically a caricature of an American, who, with his wild hair, Harley-Davidson bandana, and brawling fighting style, is just one step away from an NWA ring. Now, I can't say this for certain, but based on those two characters, I've got to think that SNK, the original developers of this week's game, Street Smart, probably at least had a passing familiarity with Bloodsport debuting in the theaters on February 26, 1988, and Street Smart making its first appearance in arcades just over a year later in August of 1989. Or, it could be a complete coincidence, and Street Smart was just SNK's way of trying to compete with Capcom's Street Fighter with a slightly different in nature but similarly named title. But, I like my idea better, and I do have a few reasons for my way of thinking. So, what are those reasons? And wait, SNK made arcade games before the Neo Geo? And finally, is the game possibly any good, considering that I don't think most people have ever heard of it? Well, we'll get into all that and more, but first, a look at the package. And here's my copy of Street Smart for the Genesis. This copy is in overall good shape, however it does have one flaw in particular, and that's for some reason the outer portion of the clamshell has been torn off at the top of the front and on the back. I don't know how that would happen, but thankfully the cover is still there, it's just not fully connected, so when it's sitting on the shelf, the inner cover is still protected. The rest of the clamshell is held up well, and the hang tab is still intact at the top. The inner cover still looks great as well, with no sun bleaching, water damage, or edge wear, which is actually a little surprising considering it was open up at the top. Street Smart would definitely be considered an obscure release in the Genesis catalog, with Treco only releasing the game in Japan and the United States, and it's definitely not one that I see very often, much like most of Treco's other releases. However, even with it being a relatively uncommon title, it doesn't sell for a ton of money, with the average sold price right now going for, between $25 to $45, and of course that is not a good sign as far as overall game quality is concerned. As far as the front cover goes, yeah, I'm not feeling it. The logo at the top is clearly supposed to be inspired by graffiti art, and I suppose it technically is in that style, but honestly, it looks like it was drawn by a middle schooler. Below the logo, there's a shirtless dude that's in the middle of beating up some guys, and I guess that goes along with the theme of the game, which is a street combat title. But who's the shirtless dude that looks like the Adventures of Ford Fairlane era Andrew Dice Clay, and why is he hitting a guy that looks suspiciously like Guile from Street Fighter II? In fact, if we're really honest about things, the entire drawing feels very inspired by the famous Street Fighter II intro scene. The original logo had its own style to it, and I think Treco would have done well to have just stuck to that rather than do its own thing. So between that, the mediocre art, and Treco putting their large logo right beneath the title, it just feels like a dollar store version of the game that you actually want. The Japanese version has another terrible logo, which is only marginally better than the United States one, but at least to their credit, it got wraparound art. And it's got the standard Treco logo, and the art actually features both of the main characters in the game. This is a clear win for the Japanese version, but neither one is blowing me away. Flipping over the rear cover, and wow, holy 60s Batman word art. Pow, blam, oof, indeed. This whole thing is a graphic design nightmare, complete with crappy-looking screenshots to boot. And the flavor text isn't much better, but at least it gives us the names of both the main characters. Let's see, Crusher and Karate Man. Yeah, I think the oof word art at the bottom is referring to those two names. Opening up the package, and the manual and cartridge are in good shape. In another potentially bad omen for the quality of the game, the manual is somewhat brief, only really consisting of 4 pages of actual instructions. Now, I know simple arcade games don't really require much in the way of a manual on how to play the game, but even still, this is impressive in its brevity, and the only game I can think of off the top of my head that had a manual this small was for hard driving. Even the intro page is almost just a complete cut and paste of the flavor text from the back of the case, so you have to wonder why they even included it. I guess just because they needed something to fill the rest of the space after ripping off Ric Flair's "to be the man, you have to beat the man" catchphrase. Okay, that's the incredibly unimpressive package. Let's fire up Street Smart and pray to all that's holy that the game is better than its casing. SNK, 3 little letters that stand for Shin Nihon Kikaku, or in English, New Japan Project. For most gamers, especially ones that frequented the arcades in the 90s and early 2000s, SNK was synonymous with the Neo Geo, a platform that combined the modularity of consoles with the power of arcade machines. The Neo Geo solved the age-old question of, how the hell do we port this game from a much more powerful arcade cabinet to work on a less advanced, i.e. cheaper, hardware, while also squeezing the game into a smaller, more affordable storage medium? By literally selling gamers with more money than sense, or their parents, a console that effectively was identical to the arcade board that would run the game, and cartridges that were likewise nearly identical to the ROM boards used in the arcade machines. So yes, the answer to that age-old question, as is many others, is simply money. Believe it or not, the Genesis actually is very similar in hardware to the all-powerful Neo Geo, as they both have a Motorola 68000 and a Zilog Z80 on board, along with a Yamaha sound processor from the OPN family of FM synth chips. This made the Genesis a prime candidate for ports of games from the Neo Geo, some of which I've previously reviewed here on Zilog and Moto, such as King of the Monsters, King of the Monsters 2, and Viewpoint. And don't worry, I fully plan on getting to the other Neo Geo originals like Fatal Fury and Super Baseball 2020, they just haven't had their turn in the schedule yet. But as I mentioned in the intro, SNK's life didn't begin with the introduction of the Neo Geo platform in 1990. Shin Nihon Kikaku actually started producing arcade games as early as 1978, and they were responsible for the original version of one of my favorite Atari 2600 games, Vanguard, which originally appeared in arcades all the way back in 1981. Exactly one of those games from the pre-Neo Geo era ended up being brought to the Genesis, which is of course our Game of the Week in Street Smart. Street Smart first appeared in arcades in August of 1989 as one of SNK's last 4 non-Neo Geo titles, running on hardware that could be seen as an earlier version of the Neo Geo, as the arcade setup featured a Motorola 68000 clocked just a tad slower, but still faster than the one in the Genesis, the same trusty Zilog Z80, and an older Yamaha OPL family sound chip. If you know anything about the library of the Neo Geo, you know that the bulk of its titles consist of various combat games, shooters, and the occasional sports title. And honestly, the vibe of Street Smart fits right in, to the point that I'm almost a bit surprised that SNK didn't create an updated version of the game early on to expand the library for home users. But, only a bit surprised, for reasons that will probably become clear later on. However, just because it has that same vibe, that doesn't mean that it's a game that's like anything else on the platform. In fact, Street Smart is a game that, I would say is honestly unlike any other fighting game that I've ever played. The Wikipedia article for Street Smart makes reference to a Taito arcade title named Violence Fight as far as drawing similarities goes, and I will say, if you're familiar with Violence Fight, it's at least similar in concept to Street Smart, but you have to have some pretty deep arcade knowledge to be familiar with either of those titles to begin with. The whole point is, Street Smart isn't Street Fighter. It's not Final Fight. It's not Fatal Fury or Art of Fighting or World Heroes. Of any of those titles I mentioned, it's probably closest to Fatal Fury for its limited selection of fighters and pseudo 3D playfield, but even then that isn't quite right. Honestly, for a game that you've actually heard of, I think Street Smart is probably closest to the B game mode in the NES version of Double Dragon. If you're not familiar with that, essentially what Street Smart is it's a one-on-one fighter where you have to make your way through 8 rounds of competition. But rather than the flat 2D environment that most one-on-one fighting games utilize, Street Smart allows you and the computer to move up, down, left, and right on the screen. So it's essentially like you're being contained to a single room from a beat-em-up, and the combat ends up having much more of a beat-em-up feel than a one-on-one fighting game feel due to that. From an originality perspective, I actually quite like the setup, and specifically, as far as the Neo Geo goes, there's really only so many one-on-one fighting games that you can play before things start to get a bit repetitive. However, once you start to dig into the game a bit, things start to get a little ugly. It becomes evident very quickly that the game is essentially a simplified beat-em-up rather than a one-on-one fighter, with the whole thing essentially being a boss rush, but split into 8 individual rounds. The controls are very simple. There's a kick button and a punch button, and since this isn't a single plain one-on-one fighter, there's also a jump button included. However, its usefulness is debatable. You can technically use it to perform a jump kick, but more than likely it's never going to land. So unless you're using the jump button to try to move around the screen quicker and maybe avoid contact, you can all but ignore that it exists. Going back to the actual combat, your goal is essentially just to kick and punch your opponent into submission. The game features a rudimentary combo system, not unlike being able to chain punches or kicks together in a standard beat-em-up, but since there's no blocking mechanism, quite frequently you'll just be trading combos with the enemy, or worse, getting grabbed and having to deal with some sort of unblockable clinch and throw attack, where you're assured to lose an annoying amount of health. To make matters worse, in the arcade version, your opponent doesn't have a life bar because that portion of the screen would be reserved for the life bar of the second player, if they were playing. Thankfully, they do the beat-em-up boss trope where they start flashing red when they're getting close to running out of health, so you'll at least know you're close to beating them. But if I've got to be honest, the whole thing feels just very Quarter Muncher-esque, and I don't know that it's possible to actually get good at it, and it's more set up to just allow you to keep putting in quarters to continue until you win the last round. I mentioned the second player option in that last section, and that does open up another aspect to the game, where you can actually team up with a second player and go up against the computer. The first player is always Karate Man, and the second player is always Crusher. The idea here is that Karate Man is the faster of the two characters, while Crusher is the stronger of the two characters. But, ultimately, you're doing the same thing no matter who you're using. It's just your punches and kicks will be slightly different depending on who you use, and there's still not a tremendous amount of skill involved either way. However, if you do play the game in two-player mode, two things change. The first is, to keep things even, you'll now be fighting two computer opponents. And the second is, if you win a round, you'll then have to fight each other to see who gets the fight scoring bonus. This does change things up slightly, and being able to tag team an enemy does make it slightly less of a game where you're just bleeding health the entire time. But, don't expect it to turn things into Streets of Rage or Final Fight. So far I've been discussing the arcade version of Street Smart, not the Genesis version, to give some background. But what about that Genesis version, since that's what we're actually reviewing here? Well, for the most part, everything I've discussed is applicable to the port. But there are some key changes I should probably go over, some basic and some where Treco clearly took things into their own hands. Probably the most radical difference between the two versions of the game is how differently two-player mode is handled. And while the rear of the package doesn't lie when it states one or two player, it's probably not what you're going to be expecting if you're a fan of the arcade game. Or even if you don't know anything about the game for that matter, because it's, fairly unusual. Playing in single player mode is mostly the same, except for one thing that I'll mention in a second. You go up against the computer, punch and kick them to death, and then move on to the next round. Okay, well what about two-player mode? Well, first the first player fights the computer, and then when that fight's over, the second player fights the exact same computer opponent. Then, assuming both the first player and the second player both win, you'll have a fight between the first player and the second player to see who wins the fight purse. So technically the game still features two-player simultaneous action, but in reality players take turns fighting the same computer opponents. It's pretty bizarre, and I guess, good on Treco for still including two-player simultaneous mode in some capacity, but I've got to be honest, it's a pretty bizarre setup. The one fundamental difference between single-player mode between the arcade and the Genesis versions of the game is that since there's no two-player simultaneous combat against the computer, you might think that means that combat is always one-on-one. Well, not true, as two of the stages have been shifted to allow you to have two opponents. Both opponents are just clones of one another, and previous opponents for that matter, with Stage 6 featuring two palette-swapped enemies from Stage 1, and Stage 7 having the two bruisers from Stage 3. With the enemy lineup not being exactly the same as the arcade version, and the fact that the Genesis version has 9 stages to the arcade version's 8, I like this curveball, even if it's clear that they're just reusing assets. Of course, it would have been nice if they could have figured out how to properly have 4 fighters on screen at once, due to the arcade version not just doubling up on the enemies when 2 are on screen, but at least they figured out a way to present the same thing in a different way, and it does require you to use some of those traditional beat-em-up strategies for when you're trying to avoid getting double-teamed. Beyond that, there are 2 other gameplay differences, but they're more geared towards enhancing the home version, and giving you something that the arcade version doesn't give you, which is of course a good thing. For the Genesis version, Treco figured out how to show the enemy's life bar, which is displayed similar to your life bar as a bunch of squares. This is a positive change in and of itself, but along with this, the Genesis version has also added a RPG-esque improvement system. After winning a fight, you'll be granted blocks that can be added in 3 stat categories: life, power, and defense. Before each fight, you'll be shown your stats versus the opponent, so you'll know where you compare and possibly give insight as to how to best build your character to compete. Honestly, I think this is a great idea, and you definitely do need to improve your character. But, it doesn't really change combat much, and you're still going to be taking tons of hits, and just hoping that you can get enough of your own in. The other change is somewhat silly, but it does alter which ending you get, so it's something to keep in mind. The Genesis version of Street Smart adds in not just the prize money aspect of fighting, but also gambling. To get the game's best ending, you have to finish the game with $8 million, but the only way to earn that much money is to bet. But not necessarily on yourself. And something that I definitely have not seen in a video game before, the game allows you to bet on your opponent winning, which will occur if you lose even a single life against them during a fight. Oh, did I forget to mention that? Since this isn't a traditional one-on-one fighter, it uses beat-em-up rules, so you technically have multiple lives to use during a fight. Anyway, the safe bet is usually to just bet on your enemy, and then if you happen to be doing really well, throw the fight at the end, and then win with your next life. The whole thing is kind of bizarre, and kids probably shouldn't be taught that sometimes it's okay to throw a fight, but like other aspects of the game, I really do appreciate them trying something different. From a graphics perspective, I think it's understood that even with the arcade game running on proto-Neo Geo hardware, it was going to lose some of its oomph in being translated to the Genesis, especially considering the fact that it's not just compressed into an 8 megabit cartridge. Treco cheaped out and went all the way down to, and this is to keep the British audience awake since this game wasn't released in Europe, a bog standard 4 megabit cartridge. As you can imagine, an arcade game filled with relatively large sprites and lots of color is going to lose some of its graphical luster, only having that much room to work with. But having said that, I don't think the game looks bad. Does it look as good as the arcade version? Of course not. But for a release from a small company in mid-1991, it could be a lot worse. The level backgrounds keep the same feel that the arcade version had, and then after each fight, there's a picture of the winner with a girl, a nod to the arcade system of having the winner collect a girl from each fight. I do have two complaints though. One, the screenshots that are displayed in the end are the same, regardless of which character that you used, and it seems a bit weird to see pictures of Karate Man if you chose Crusher as your playthrough instead. The second complaint is more than just a graphical issue though, and that's that on the far sides of each level, there's an invisible border that you can't walk across, but the computer can, meaning that once you get to the border, you have to try to kite the enemy back to the middle of the playfield, or else they'll just hang out in the corner and be able to hit you, but not vice versa. This is a strange one, and it's not a problem that the arcade version has, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. Like the ending picture issue, it's not a huge deal, but it does kind of just leave you wondering why. The music in Street Smart is honestly not bad. Each stage gets its own track, and they all sound pretty good, while providing a good background for the on-screen action. There's nothing here that rises to the level of excellent as far as music's concerned, but I've certainly heard far worse with some of these more obscure third-party titles. Like the graphics, it's a step down from the arcade version, but honestly, I would say that the music holds up better compared to the visuals. However, what doesn't hold up as well is the sound effects. The cheering from the fans has been carried over from the arcade, so that's nice, but all of the actual combat effects appear to have been replaced with something that sounds like each of the fighters is farting when punches and kicks are thrown. I guess it was too much to ask for both the music and the sound effects to be good, but, I suppose at least they got one of them right. When playing these obscure third-party titles, they almost always go one of two ways. They're either nice little diamonds in the rough, or they're awful games that were clearly developed on the cheap so that the publisher could make as much money as possible off of their license investment. And when I started the review, Street Smart was clearly in the camp of the latter, as it was a game that, without really trying, I was able to finish with both characters inside of an hour. I almost spent as much time going back and playing the arcade version just for quick comparison purposes. And I could just imagine, some poor kid who was allowed to rent one game per weekend back in the day, renting this and then being done with it after an hour, leaving them the entire rest of the weekend to find something else to do, while thinking about what a waste of a rental this was. But then, as I dove deeper into writing the rest of the review, I started to think about how unique the title is, despite the game's faults. How it dared to do things that other games didn't. And for, about 5 minutes there, I completely lost my mind and was going to actually give it 2 stars, just for being different. However, just like the old adage goes, just because you're unique doesn't mean you're useful. And just because Street Smart is a unique title in the Genesis library, that doesn't mean that I should give it more than a single star that it ultimately deserves. Treco clearly tried something new here, and I do believe they should be given credit for that. But this is still a 1-star game, there's no question. And that's it for Street Smart for the Genesis. This is one of those reviews that I enjoyed doing simply for the fact that now, I know what Street Smart is all about. And I don't have to see that goofy title logo and cover on my shelf or at a convention anymore and wonder, what's that game all about? It's also one of those reviews where I spent far longer actually working on the review than playing the game, which kinda sucks, but I guess I'd rather waste a short amount of time playing a mediocre game than a longer amount of time playing a bad game, which has happened previously in other reviews, and I'm sure will happen again. Next time on the channel, well, looking ahead to the rest of December, I'm planning on 3 more reviews and then wrapping things up with the annual end of the year wrap-up, / awards video. For the first of those reviews, it's one of those seemingly many games in the library where I remember seeing it back in the day in stores and in magazines, but I never actually played it, which is actually a little surprising, seeing as how I was a pretty big fan of the subject matter back in the day. So much so that when I moved to Chicago and went to a large comic book convention for the first time, I immediately bought this, and it's been hanging on the wall outside of my room ever since. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go invent a time machine so I can go back to that convention and buy some games as well. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 310. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.